So today we're going to be discussing the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is a period that starts in the late 1600s and goes through to about 1850. This 170 or so year period is a period where it's an intellectual movement within Europe, and people start to ask questions about how or why society operates in certain ways. And the emergence of the Enlightenment is really attached to this application of reason to society. So looking at institutions that had dominated European lifestyles for you know thousands of years and asking the question, is this really the best way that we organize our society? So the Enlightenment is a period where the church or religion in general, the Catholic Church that is, or religion in general, begin to get questioned, right? Why does the church get preferential treatment? Why do we believe, or why is it that there's a belief in God actively participating in human society? And are those things valuable to the lives of individuals? And the application of reason comes from the scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution is another intellectual movement that takes place in the century or century and a half before the Enlightenment. So from roughly about 1550 on to about 1600 or so, 1700 or so. Now, there are major causes to the scientific revolution, right? So the scientific revolution does not just pop out of nowhere. And the first major cause is medieval universities. So if you look at the map on the screen currently, the medieval universities of Europe are, for the most part, established in the 1100s. You have a few examples where you might have a place like Bologna that is 1088. But there's a few, but for the most part, right, you're talking in, the 12th century, Oxford and Cambridge in the 1300s, Dublin in 1312, right? And you can see that there's this massive amount of universities popping up throughout the world, throughout Europe in this period. And in these places, there are free thinking. After 1450, there is the movement of printing presses to all of these locations. And the questions of, again, why do we believe this? Why do we do this? Begins to emerge in these locations. There's also, the Renaissance, which is again happening in Europe around the same time as these universities are being founded, where you have looking back at Euclid and Pythagoras and looking at all these great mathematicians from Greece, and again applying those things to society. To the natural world, right? So the scientific revolution is really about using reason to look at the natural world, right? Find the laws that govern the world. So Isaac Newton in the 1600s, right, comes up with or develops the ideas that will lead to the understanding of gravity. Again, none of this is really, for the most part, anti-religious, right? We sort of, certainly today, we might equate science with anti-religion, and that's not the case here. In a lot of cases, it's all about finding God in these natural laws. So that's what these people are doing. They're trying to find God in these natural laws. When we move to the end of the 1600s, it's now using that reason, using that idea of scientific discovery to study the social world. So when it comes to the middle of the 1600s, really the first person to start studying the natural world and asking and really using this sort of reason to study the world is Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes has a very pessimistic view of human society, and he questions the ability of average people to basically operate outside of self-interest, right? So he says that if there's no government, life would be nasty, brutish, and short because people are not inherently good, and we're always going to be using self-interest. So he advocates for the establishment of government to protect people from themselves or from each other. And as a result, there needs to be a strong government and a strong leadership in order to protect that. In contrast to Hobbes is John Locke. So John Locke John Locke is born in the 1640s, late 1640s. So he is, 2 generations younger than Thomas Hobbes, or at least a generation and a half younger. But he has a more optimistic view, or at least, let's say optimistic view of people. And what he says is that people are inherently good, but we need government to protect our we need government to protect our life, liberty, and property. That so we give up our rights, we give up our freedoms to be part of a society in order for government to protect us. However, if government does not protect us, if government does not do what it's supposed to do, it is our responsibility as human beings, as individuals, to overthrow that government. So for Locke, it's all about using our using our freedoms that we give up in order to create this social contract, right? We give up part of our freedoms, part of our liberties for protection from the government. So for John Locke, it's all about, again, this idea of life, liberty, and property, and the protection that governments provide. So what Locke says, right, is that men being born equal in nature, free, equal, and independent, right? No one can sort of take you away from your possessions without your own consent, meaning that in order for you to enter into this, you are doing this freely, right? And because of that, because every man consents, right, to enter into a civil society, to enter into a government, that you are putting yourself under the obligation of everyone else in the society. And this creates a situation whereby we are setting up our government. We believe in a rule of law. And again, we are doing this freely. We are doing this because that is sort of how we need to protect these liberties. Now, throughout this period, right, other people start asking the questions about society. So about 100 years later, Immanuel Kant comes around, and Immanuel Kant is, so Locke and Hobbes were both English. Kant is from what is today Poland, but at the time would have been considered a part of Germany, part of Germany. So he writes a couple of really important books. His first major book is a critique of pure reason, where he advocates a bit more than I think a lot of other people would have expected about the role of God in this idea of deism, sort of natural religion. His most famous essay is called "What is Enlightenment?" Now, in this paper, he talks a lot about this idea of releasing oneself from your self-imposed nonage or tutelage or immaturity. Basically, this idea that we can release ourselves from being naive. And we have these, we have to be able to dare to know, right? Ask questions, try and be more active citizens. And he is saying that in terms of, trying to fight against people who are considered self-appointed guardians, people who are there that protect or guard information. So again, Kant is pushing us to think about society. And again, this is something that all people can do. So you have a couple of other major philosophers. One major philosopher is a guy by the name of Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a French, French author from southwestern France, where he writes about the separation of powers within a government. So he looks at the French government and looks at the French society, and he says there are three types of power. There's the executive power, the judicial power, and the legislative power. And in these three separate powers, right, we give all, in French society in the 1740s, all of that power is given really to the monarch. Is that the way we should do it? And he writes the book, The Spirit of the Laws, where he separates these powers out. And he talks about why the executive power should be separated from the legislative, and why the legislative should be separate from the judicial. And all of this, right? And again, you for those of you who are American history fans, you will remember that this is the basis of the American Constitution, right? And other constitutions that come afterward. So again, it's Montesquieu is asking the question, why do we need to have government organized in this way? You have others, right? Cesare Beccaria asks the question about punishment. Is capital punishment, is execution a really good process? Are there better ways to organize criminal justice reform and criminal justice punishment? You have Mary Wollstonecraft, who is English, who asks a question about women's education. And she writes a couple of books, but her most famous book is The Vindication of the Rights of Women, where he argues about, where she argues about the need for women to be educated, right? Women are parts of society. Women are responsible for educating, being the first educators of children. And it is important for women to be educated so that they can be better mothers. Adam Smith, I think, is one of the most important philosophers of the period. So Adam Smith is a Scottish philosopher who is a professor from the 1750s into the 1760s at the University of Glasgow, but he also becomes a private tutor. He sort of travels a lot, and he travels a lot around Europe. In 1776, he writes a book called he publishes a book called The Wealth of Nations. And this book is what we consider really the first book on modern economics. And in this, he discusses how the individual has the best ability to decide where his or her money should be most used, right? And he's saying that the government should not have any say in where you spend your money. So during the 1770s in particular, right, there's this economic theory called mercantilism, where the government can set up tariffs and barriers and to prevent trading among certain to other places, right? So if you're in the British Empire, right? So if you're in Britain, if you're in Great Britain, and you're trading in North America, right? They can say, well, you can't buy tea from the Dutch, the Tea Act, right? The thing that causes the Boston Tea Party. And that idea of mercantilism says that, and the reason for that is that the money then goes back to London, and that is where all of this, that the colonies are for the benefit of all people. The colonies are the benefit of the mother country, not for the people. Smith argues that if you remove that tariff, remove that monopoly, what you see instead is that people maybe buy the cheaper tea from the Dutch, but they also have money then to spend on other things. So they are taking that money and they're spreading it out further than dropping it on one item. And for Smith, he calls that the invisible hand, right? That there are these forces within the economy that move items around. Thomas Paine, I think, is another really great example of the Enlightenment. Thomas Paine, writes a book in 1776, January of 1776, called Common Sense, and this book is one of the major things that pushes a lot of people towards the American Revolution and independence in the 1770s. He also becomes really famous for, I guess I should say infamous for, his work within the French Revolution. He writes The Rights of Man and then The Age of Reason in 1791 and 1794. So he moves around a lot. He's English. He moves to North America. He goes to France. He winds up in French prison for a little while. Comes back to North America. Dies in upstate New York. But again, so in the book Common Sense, that pushes a lot of people towards independence, he argues that you can't, it is not common sense to have a colony run by an empire that's 3,000 miles away. And again, pushing for independence. One of the things I would put in here just to sort of finish up is that, one of the things I've been applying here is that the Enlightenment is not a fixed location. The Enlightenment happens in Europe and in the Americas and in the Caribbean and in South America. These ideas move. And all of these people would have known each other's writings, would have known each other maybe even personally, right? So Benjamin Franklin, we don't know for sure, but there is good indication that he met Adam Smith. Thomas Jefferson was a really good friend with the French philosophers, Rousseau and Voltaire. So all of these, and they certainly all wrote letters to one another. There's this idea, there's this phrase that they talk to each other about, the Republic of Letters, right? This idea that there's sort of this state or this society where letters are written to each other across the Atlantic Ocean. When the American Revolution begins, the question becomes, why does the British Empire govern us the way that they do? And that is the question that these three men and the other members of the American philosophers, the American Enlightenment, begin to question.